Good morning, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Marta Alberti, and I work for the Vindolanda Trust as their site archaeologist. I specialize in textile tools on the frontier. Spindle whorls in particular are my absolute passion, and I also have a keen interest in public participation in archaeological heritage practices. The paper that I am presenting today has the same title as a paper that I published with the Theoretical Journal of Roman Archaeology, which you can download online, but it also has some slightly updated content. I also wanted to start today by thanking the Roman Finds Group for a lovely grant that they gave me all those years ago when I started studying spindle whorls in Vindolanda, which provided the beautiful line drawings by Mark Hoyle, which you will see today, starting with the one at the top of the page here. Let's dive right in with this image of a woman tombstone from Pannonia. So this is the tombstone of Verruga, and the presence of a spindle whorl right there, which I zoomed in for you, tells us a lot about why it is important to study spindle whorls. These are small but mighty artifacts that are connected to the powerful symbolism of female virtue and are one of the few Roman finds that we can be confident in associating with the feminine gender. Spindle whorls are also very conservative artifacts, and their aspect and function change very little through time, meaning that they're fairly easy to recognize and analyze through different periods of Roman occupation. They are everywhere on Hadrian's Wall, although a comprehensive catalogue does not exist at present. Besides being mentioned in the work of John Peter Wild, they've also been looked at by Andrew Burley, who in 2010 used them together with other artifacts to argue for the fort wall as a permeable barrier between civilian and army life in the 3rd and 4th century. The assemblage approach, which Andrew used in his research, was pioneered by scholars such as Alison Jones and Tim Allison. In 2002, Cool and Baxter said that finds have the greatest ability to illuminate the past when they are regarded as an integral part of the archaeological record. The assemblage approach allows to accomplish amazing things, such as these distribution maps. On the left, you see a map of the 3rd century spindle whorls in the 1970 to 2008 excavation, which fairly then compares with loads of maps of other 4th century whorls and artifacts associated with non-combatants. On the right is a map I produced, which we'll explore in detail a little bit later, but it shows the distribution of 4th century spindle whorls in the northwestern quadrant of the fort. And in blue are spindle whorls in prestigious materials. We should also not forget that spindle whorls are an assemblage within an assemblage. They are a part of the wider assemblage of textile tools. This is something that one of my favorite authors on the subject, which is Gostencic, does very well in her study of Fabianis, which is a small fort on the Danube. She concludes that it is a weaving production center and that perhaps spinning is carried out in other places. In this paper, I use a combination of the assemblage approach and a more traditional small finds approach, which looks at the shape, weight, and decoration of each artifact. In particular, in the case of spindle whorls, a combined approach can lead us to kind of some new and interesting avenues. Experimental archaeology by the Center for Textile Research in Copenhagen, which is a center that I recommend everybody visits online because it's fantastic, has proven that the ratio between a spindle whorl's weight and its diameter, combined with the spinner's experience, influences the thickness and the weight of the yarn. Another project by the CTR, I'll leave you the link there in blue, lower down, explores the importance of studying the finished object through the actions and the movements of the craftsperson. So being aware of the materiality of this object and the ways it was used in real life. Another project that does this is one of a colleague, Magdalena Ullman, and this, you can see at the bottom, is an acoustic spectrogram, which is showing the record of sound's frequency and intensity when weaving a tabby weave with a 26 loom weight setup. So it's quite interesting, you know, things have a sound, you know, there is a sound that textile production makes. Today, we're going to explore 3 research questions related to spindle whorls using the combined approach we outlined before. First of all, were spindle whorls bought or were they made? If they were they made primarily of recycled materials, or were they crafted on purpose out of brand new materials? And then moving on with their life, what about spindle whorls' use? Is there any sign of use wear on these whorls? And if there is, how does it relate to material and decoration? And finally, where are these spindle whorls in the archaeological setting? So can we gain some insight on the social world of spinners when contextual information is available? And what can we learn from spindle whorls when it isn't? To answer these questions, I've looked at 2 very well-known sites, which are Vindolanda, of course, and Corbridge. Vindolanda is a site well known to most of you by now and has been continuously excavated since 1970. But we want to embrace the whole of the material culture there, because otherwise I'd speak to you for 5 hours. This paper focuses on material from 2 areas within the boundaries of the last stone fort. The northwestern quadrant in blue was investigated between 2008 and 2012, and the southeastern quadrant between 2013 and 2017. In both areas, we have significant remains from several distinct phases of occupation, but again, we're only going to focus on the 3rd century, starting from 213 and ending with the abandonment of the site in 267. And then we pick up again from 303 when the site is reoccupied until the early sub-Roman layers. As far as Corbridge is concerned, it's another well-known staying fort and later commercial hub. It was explored in numerous excavation campaigns, the first of which you see pictured here. More photos are linked below, and I suggest if you're interested in this kind of stuff, you go and see them because they're fantastic. This first excavation took place between 1906 and 1914. The establishment of Corbridge training as a training site connected to the University of Durham then began in 1934, but the field school only really got going after the war between 1947 and 73. And then in 1976 to 1980, work was conducted ahead of the construction of the museum. While some contextual evidence is available from late excavations and finds such as copper alloys are thoroughly documented, spindle whorls are simply listed as discs or counters, and most of them are unprovenanced. In winter 2015, with the gracious help of curator Frances McIntosh, I decided to grab the bull by the horns and start with Corbridge, my catalogue of spindle whorls on the wall. Sadly, there isn't a collective name for a large group of spindle whorls, so I had to come up with one. It's probably not the best one, so all suggestions are well accepted. Textile production is rated by Dross Group as the 2nd most important economic branch of the Roman Empire after agriculture. Therefore, it is hardly surprising that concentrations of textile tools appear in various degrees along the Roman frontier. At Vindolanda, 380 spindle whorls were found between 1970 and the present day. Of them, 32% has been found in the last 12 years. The site dwarfs even Corbridge in number, where at Corbridge only 139 whorls were found. As you can see, spindle whorls are so common at Vindolanda that they rank in numbers just below very common finds such as beads or iron knives. When considering the materials spindle whorls are made of, it becomes immediately apparent that pottery dominates the scene, Between 78 and 89% of assemblages are composed by recycled pottery. And within that percentage, a high number is made of terra sigillata. Pottery whorls are discoid in shape, so they're like a flying saucer, flat and in a disc. And they sometimes can have a bit of a curve if the body of the sherd was used to produce the spindle whorl. The edge of the pottery disc can be more or less worn, and the central hole is about 5 millimeters in general. There is also plenty of variation, however, with the second most popular being jet or shale, followed by polished bone. Both materials require a lathe like wooden whorls, which unfortunately do not survive in the 3rd and 4th century context. It is likely that whorls made out of jet, shale, or polished bone would be sold as a finished product as opposed to pottery whorls. And pottery or stone whorls could be instead made by the spinners. Once again, the first of these two graphs shows how plain recycled pottery spindle whorls were the majority at both Vindolanda with 75 items and Corbridge with 94. However, it is interesting to note how decorated pottery spindle whorls outnumbered decorated spindle whorls in other materials at both Vindolanda and Corbridge. Through my research, I've come to wonder whether decorated spindle whorls in shale or bone were more of a status symbol, a gift, an expensive purchase, a statement piece, and pottery whorls instead were the true beast of burden of the spinning craft. If this was the case, and we accept that pottery whorls can be crafted by spinners, this gives women the agency of crafting their own tools to the specification that fit them and their level of expertise. In the second graph, I break down the Vindolanda assemblage a little bit further. In the northwestern quadrant, populated by infantry in the 3rd and 4th century, we can see that the assemblage is dominated by plain pottery whorls. However, proportionally, a much higher percentage of decorated high-status pottery, non-pottery, but other prestigious materials spindle whorls was recorded in the southeast quadrant. You can see here 9-4 and 9-5, but if we think that we found many less spindle whorls in the southeastern quadrant, we can understand that proportionally this is quite important. And so through our observation, we can build a pyramidal hierarchy of spindle whorls. At the top of the pyramid are the most expensive whorls that are made of materials such as jet, shale, or bone. These are predominantly decorated on either side or on the profile. But there are also plain, prestigious material spindle whorls if we slide down one step of our pyramid. Further below are the decorated pottery spindle whorls, such as those made out of recycled terra sigillata, or the one in the image is a black burnished. These were sometimes obtained by reshaping and piercing the bottom of very small shapes. So very small terra sigillata shapes or neem valley color coated caps. The bottom gets cut off, the sides get smoothed, a hole gets pierced through the fabric, and here you have a spindle whorls. Finally, we have the plain recycled spindle whorls like this one, which can be made of pottery or stone. This pyramid does not mean that a spinner who owned an item from the top category couldn't have many more items from the tiers below, but it does make it less likely that a spinner who only owned plain recycled spindle whorls would also have access to the top of the pecking order. At this point of my research, I had looked at photographed hundreds of spindle whorls, some pretty, some ugly. So I started noticing a particular circular pattern, sometimes on both faces of the whorl. University and applied it to Bronze Age weapon and combat, but I was truly observing usewear mark on spindle whorls, or was it all in my head? For a while, I thought it was all in my head, but more and more of my colleagues started coming to me with spindle whorls with usewear marks, and they agreed with me. Magdalena, who I've mentioned before, also found this piece of pottery here talking about the hand-worn spindles. Upon closer inspection, several usewear traces can be observed on most of the spindle whorls in our assemblages, both Vindolanda and Corbridge. A polished, shiny circular shape like this can often be observed around a central hole on one or both surfaces. Indentations can be seen around the central perforation, where the friction of the spindle whorl causes small breakages. This you can see in the Samian whorl at the top of the screen. When comparing the position of traces of usewear on decorated spindle whorls with the position of traces of usewear on non-decorated spindle whorls, an important detail emerged. The polished circle was only visible on the face of the whorl opposite to the decoration, as you can see in the jet and stone example. However, when the decoration was present on both sides, like in the Corbridge jet example, it was perfectly contained within the boundaries of the decoration. So as you can see here, it fits perfectly in the little 3 circles. The Samian whorl at the top is once again a really good example. Here we have a polished central concentric area on the opposite face of the decoration. The worn edges where the hand would grab the spindle whorl to spin it, and small breakages around the central perforations opposite the decorated side. On undecorated spindle whorls, the polished circle and worn out edges can be seen on both sides, like so. But damage around a certain perforation is often more pronounced on one side than on the other, like you can see in the Samian spindle whorl here at the top. I could spend hours boring you with this, but in short, I reckon that decoration and usewear are connected to one another, and that at a conscious or subconscious level, decoration can tell us which way up a whorl can be used, where the cup of spun yarn should rest, and would even suggest to the spinner when the spindle whorl is full and it's time to change it. That is, of course, all suppressed by times like this one depicted here, in which the fiber is still nice and trapped around the edge of the perforation. And now for the last bit of my talk, I want to talk a little bit about distribution. So let's see, what we've got here is a distributional map of spindle whorls in the northwestern quadrant in the 3rd century. We can see that the pottery and kind of undecorated plain spindle whorls are more common than the high status material in the 3rd century. But they are where we would expect to be, in a sense, once we've moved past the idea that civilians were relegated to the extramural settlement and that military activity only took place within the fort. We would expect some activity of spinning taking place within the barracks and on the street. But things get a lot more interesting when we ramp it up to the 4th century. So here you can see the same pattern of scarcity of spindle whorls in the 3rd century is also repeated in the southeastern quadrant. There is only a few, they're concentrated on streets, roads, and discard sites like the ditch. But let's look at the 4th century, all those yellow triangles. Spindle whorls are everywhere. We know that at Vindolanda, after 303, all of the community moves within the boundaries of the fort wall. So that makes sense with a heightened intensity of spinning activities. Massively concentrated in barrack spaces are all the spindle whorls in both quadrants of the site. But let's look at the prestigious whorls, so the top tier of our pyramid. They are concentrated in what was discussed as a officer's schola right here. There is one in this which we reckon is a decurions apartment. So it's quite interesting to observe how well distributed they are, how they're commingled with the pottery spindle whorls. I think it's also very visually powerful to see where all these women discarded their used textile tools. So I've run out of time and I want to conclude. I want to leave you some time to read these conclusions properly. But if I was to summarize them in little punchline, I would say that in both Vindolanda and Corbridge, you could both buy or make your spindle whorl. You could buy it in materials such as jet, shale, or bone, or you could make it to your own specifications by picking up a sherd of pottery that you found suitable. Interestingly, the most decorated spindle whorls that are made of pottery come from terra sigillata sherds. As far as useware, as we've said, I do believe that useware and decoration are connected to one another, and I believe that decoration can be prescriptive, as in it can tell us which way you stick the spindle whorl on the spindle rods. And then we have looked at the merits of the analyzing spindle whorl's distribution on a site like Vindolanda, the visually powerful statement that it makes about the presence of women inside the fort walls, and the visual and important impact it makes about wealth and the location of wealth inside the fort walls again. So this is me done. Thanks for your time and attention, and thanks to the Roman Science Group for having me. And if you have any questions, I would be delighted to answer them.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Marta. There's been a small debate going on in the chat room about the possibility of lead being used for whorls. And Jorn, I don't know if you'd like to put your observations directly to Marta. Jorn, you're still muted. We can't hear you.
Okay, now it should work.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hello. Yeah, I was wondering about lead whorls. Since I dabble in metalwork more often, obviously that's the ones I look at more often. Have you got any of those, or is that completely unknown from Vindolanda? Because there are a few in other Roman sites, and quite a few also, well, up into the medieval period and beyond.
Yes, lead is one of the reasons why I don't have any from Vindolanda in lead is that lead is a widely recyclable material. It's very malleable, and you can turn it into anything you want pretty much. And spindle whorls made out of lead, yes, they're good. They produced very strong twine. They would have been used. I have some examples, 2 or 3 from Corbridge. But then they're also this big. And once you've finished using it, it's enough to warm it with your hands to make a ball of lead and make it into something else. So I do think that spindle whorls that are made out of lead are present. I have only 3 or 4 examples from Corbridge, which are in the database. They're mentioned in my article. They're never decorated. They're always just plain discs of lead. And I do think that perhaps at Vindolanda, what we've seen is people scrunching them up and turning them into something else, or discarding them in a way that they're not recognizable as spindle whorls anymore. It's a bit of a mystery, because I'm sure that they had them as much as you, but they're just not there.
Oh, right. That's interesting. Thank you.
Okay, there's a couple more comments about lead whorls. I can see Simon Nicholson is saying lead whorls are the most common on Paz. Susan Rands, who does some spinning, just wonders whether they're too heavy to have been used as spindle whorls. But can I?
It depends. It depends. There are some like some wonderful, beautiful, enormous ones that have been labeled as spindle whorls, but I don't think they are, because they are too big and too heavy. But not being a spinner myself, I'm very clumsy. So it's a very sad true story that I can't spin at all. That would be a really interesting point to do some experimental archaeology with Roman spindle whorls. I think most of the experimental archaeology has been done with Bronze Age pieces. So it'd be great to do some frontier experimental archaeology of spinning. I would love it.
Okay, that's good. Chris Hudson has an interesting question. Chris, would you like to unmute and ask your question direct to Marta?
I will have a go.
That's good.
It's coming from a position of total ignorance, I'm afraid, on my side, of how long a number of hours in a day these spindles might have been used for and needed, and whether it was a sort of seasonal use for them as well. And does that give any sort of indication tied in with the status and which ones are decorated and so on? In other words, were some people obviously using it as a bit of a time filler or a way to sit in front of a fire and do some things, where other people were using them on a much more commercial, full-time basis? I don't know.
Spinning. No, it's a good, interesting question, which caters to all of those who've never wandered, kind of waded into the magical world of hand spinning. I was one of them until a few years ago. Spinning is a constant activity. It is used as a status affirming activity. It is depicted on burial stones. It's something that women would do constantly. They would spin and talk, spin and walk, spin and tend to their children. Of course, if you were a more high status woman who had other more pressing concerns during her daily life, I suppose, such as presenting yourself as the leader of the women of the fort. You know, we know that this is the role that many commanding officers' wives took upon themselves. I don't suppose you spun quite so much, but it is a very common activity. So they are, yes, intensively used. They are sometimes worn down to nothingness. So yes, definitely a very frequent activity. It can be done indoors, outdoors. I suppose it's probably best done as when you've kind of just soon after you've sheared a sheep, because you do all your preparation, all your fleece prep in one go, and then you start doing your spinning. But equally, prepped fleece can last a long time, and you don't need to spin it all in one go. So you can have a massive stash of prepped fleece and then do it bit by bit. So I don't think it's a seasonal activity. I see in the chat that someone said Roman soldiers did not use the whorl themselves. This is something that's been thoroughly debated. Whether men could have access to spindle whorls based on the fact that most of them had a sort of what we wrongly, I think, called a housewife kit, so something that would allow them to care for their hygiene and do some minor sewing and mending. But as I said, spinning is a very, very, very gendered activity. There is a story of Emperor Elagabalus being ripped to pieces because he had a love for spinning. It's really not something that a man would do in his spare time.
Okay, thanks, Marta. Time's pressing, but I'm just going to have one more question. There's a few other things to observe first. Deborah Haywood said, "I've heard it takes 5 spinners to keep one weaver working." That's very interesting. But there was a question a bit earlier on around jet and shale, in particular from Sarah Steele. Sarah, would you like to ask your questions or observations direct, please?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm here.
Yeah, I was just interested. I really love that, by the way. But I'm just interested.
Thank you.
Why are you grouping jet and shale together, and why are you treating cannel coals separately? Is that problem with species identification, or is there another reason for doing that? I
only have one cannel coal, so I wanted her to stand out. Poor thing. It's ugly. Okay. You will see it as when the paper is recorded and put back online. It's in one of the first slides. It's cracked. It's ugly. It's terrible. I think someone had a little experiment with cannel coal and thought, no, I will not do that again. Jet and shale, really quite difficult to identify from one another to the layperson's eye without kind of taking a little fragment of the artifact, especially when you polish shale to such a shine that it could be jet, and you don't really want to start taking bits. So my level of expertise doesn't allow that. So I thought I'm just gonna
group it together. Oh, I might I'll drop you an email and come and have a look at your finds, because I'm doing a PhD on jet identification methods. So I've got a whole new methodology to separate these materials. But I have indeed made a jet spindle whorl. I can confirm I'm not the best drop spinner, but I can confirm it's absolutely useless for anything other than assisted spinning. You really, if productivity was your end goal, you would never use something with as lower specific gravity as jet for spindle whorl. So
yeah, I think it makes a nice statement piece.
Yeah,
like me and how beautiful my spindle whorl is.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I know we haven't managed to deal with all of the questions that have been put, but I think we must move on now. If I could ask Marta to close your mic and video down, and we're going to move on to Tim Penn. Thank you ever so much for that. Really interesting talk, Marta. Okay, Tim, I can see you have your video switched on.
Hi.
Tim from the University of Edinburgh is our next paper with a paper entitled Gaming Boards, Military Communities and the Transmission of Ideas, the View from